start off by saying I can see where the affirmative team comes from. They have good intentions. We want to have China paying back their debt. We want to have them paying back their obligations to the United States. And that has a good intention. But ultimately, the affirmative team agreed that policy should be based off of facts and evidence rather than emotional appeal. And what we're going to be talking about today is how the affirmative team cannot even guarantee the most basic thing, that their plan will solve the issue. We're going to be examining this by broadly looking at the issue that the affirmative team is not going to prove that China or the PRC will agree to a debt resettlement. So let's move on to that point. They must prove the PRC will agree to a debt resettlement. Now, the affirmative team tried to get out of this in their last speech by saying it's an impossible standard. I have two responses. First, their solvency hinges upon this one issue. Their entire solvency, a stock issue, which means whether or not they'll solve the problem, hinges upon this one point. So what the affirmative team is conceding is that they can't even guarantee you that they will even solve the issue. But my second point is that they said it's reasonable that China would do so. If it's so reasonable, why haven't they given you one piece of evidence that China would agree to a US debt resettlement? They talk about how it's reasonable and how 47 representatives advocate their plan. They talk about how we have so many advocates saying this, yet they have been unable to fulfill my partner's burden of proof he laid upon them in their last speech, a burden of proof they dropped, that they have to give you just one piece of evidence saying China would actually agree to a debt resettlement with the United States. The impact of this is that the burden of proof is not upheld. The burden of proof is not upheld. We're going to be talking about historical precedents in just a bit, but right now, the affirmative team in both of their constructives have not been able to give you one piece of evidence, one proof, to uphold the burden of proof that their plan would actually work and that China would agree to negotiations. And the reason for this is when you negotiate with another country, you don't really know what the outcome is. Because when you negotiate, you're not doing it unilaterally, you're doing it bilaterally, meaning there has to be compromise on both sides, meaning the result is often uncertain, meaning we might not get the outcome we want to. So the affirmative team would actually have to read evidence saying the preferred outcome would actually result from negotiations, and they have not given that. But let's talk about historical precedents. They had basically 2 points under historical precedents. The 47 countries, and they said 57 in their last speech, but I think they meant 47, and England. Let's begin with the first, 47 countries. Now my first point, what I'm going to be responding here is they can't prove that it's the same under the case with China. First of all, there was no successor governments. No successor governments. The affirmative team would have to prove with these 47 countries there were actually successor governments. Because as my partner pointed out and they dropped, even when there's a successor government, only when the government does not exist is the successor government liable. So the affirmative team would actually prove how many of these 47 countries in which there was no successor government, because most of these countries are countries that were existing at that time and had existed when they started to owe the debt. Secondly, mutual consent. When we did these negotiations with 47 countries, both sides agreed to do it, the United States and the other country. But there's no evidence saying China would agree to it. There's no evidence saying there's mutual consent with China. This is a flawed reasoning on the part of the affirmative team that they're just assuming there'll be mutual consent. And third of all, we have to look at the amount of money. How much money was involved with those cases? Because if it was a small amount of money, the other country really wouldn't care. But if it's a large amount of money, China's more likely to care. In fact, their one example in their 1AC, when they say there were 47 instances, they read a part that was not read, in which they talked about the Polish government. And the Polish government only owed the United States $8.5 million. That's just one of the examples of the 47 instances they gave. They say there's 47 instances in which other countries agreed. And what they didn't read is one of the examples of those 47 instances was when Poland, but that was only $8.5 million. So of course they're going to agree to it. Relatively speaking, it's not a large amount of money. So just because we do it with other countries doesn't mean it's going to work with China, because China owes us $750 billion. That's an extraordinary amount of money. There's no proof China would agree to it given this amount of money. Now let's move on to the second point, that of Britain. Does Britain actually prove the affirmative team's case, or was that just a one-time thing with Margaret Thatcher and what they were doing? Now my first point under this is that it's a contradiction. They said that Argentina does not apply because there was a different agency involved. But England has a different agency than we will be using under our plan. Thus, if you are applying the same standard of the same agency, their own argument shows that they're a contradiction. England had a different agency than we'll be using under the affirmative team's plan. Thus, just because England did it doesn't mean you'll be able to do it with the United States. But my next point under this is actually leverage. What leverage did Margaret Thatcher use? And in the affirmative team's piece of evidence, it's actually very interesting. This is what their piece of evidence says from the American Bondholders Foundation. quote, in 1987, threatened with being kept out of British financial markets, China acknowledged the debt it owed, end quote. Threatened with being kept out of British financial markets. So Margaret Thatcher had leverage. She said, if you don't pay back the debt, you will be kept out of our financial system. The affirmative team is not using this leverage under their plan. They're just saying, your credit rating is magically going to drop, thus that's our leverage. But that's not the same as being kept out of the entire financial system. Also, back then, the yuan was less recognized as an international currency as it is now. Thus, China would really have an incentive to be part of the British financial market because they didn't have a say back then. Back then, China was a developing country. Right now, China is one of the world's largest economies, and their yuan is internationally recognized as being a good currency. The impact of this is that Britain doesn't apply. Britain doesn't apply for the reasons, first of all, that it was a different agency, and secondly, because they had leverage, but also I'd like to add a third one, which is that once again there was mutual consent. Because of the leverage, England agreed to do it, but there's no evidence that China will agree to do it if we pass the affirmative team's plan. Once again, there is no precedence for the affirmative team's case, and that's why it's important that we need evidence saying China would actually agree to this debt resettlement. There's no proof their plan will actually work. Now, let's talk about the affirmative team's leverage. They say that if you don't pay back your debt, your credit rating will drop. Here's the thing. China's not paying back their debt in the current system. In the status quo, then, for all purposes and intents, China has already defaulted. China's not paying the debt right now. That's what the evidence the affirmative team read in their 1AC. So the impact of this is that there's no change in the credit score. There's no change in the credit score because China's already not paying back their debt right now. Even if we just say, we're going to recognize you, they're not paying the debt, so there's no tangible impact on whether or not China's paying back their debt. And they also said no credit agency recognized that China has defaulted. They read no evidence to suggest that this is the case. They actually have to prove that official recognition of defaulting matters, and they have not given you that evidence. Now they also said that they said under international law there's a successor of government doctrine to prove that we're justified to pay back the debt. But they ignored my partner's point that the successor of government doctrine only applies when there's no previous government. But there is a previous government in this case. It's a little island called Taiwan, also known as the Republic of China. Thus, the affirmative team's argument of the successor of government doctrine does not apply, because my partner did in fact read evidence stating that the successor of government doctrine only applies when the previous government does not exist. What does this debate come down to now? This debate comes down to the fact that the affirmative team's plan hinges on the appeal of wanting to benefit American citizens. And we as the negative team recognize that. We want to help American citizens. But the affirmative team's plan is not doing it the right way.
Is everyone ready? All right, good afternoon, Joshua. I just have a couple questions. First of all, could we have the piece of evidence that says that the successor government doctrine states that it only applies if the previous government doesn't?
My partner read that in his 1AC.
All right, could you pass it back to our
Sure, after this part time to you. Unless my partner needs it for his next speech, of course.
All right, sure. So how are we supposed to prove that China will 100% agree to these negotiations?
I believe you've said yourself we're an impossible standard, and that is a reason to vote against your case. You chose a case that you have to prove, and yet you're not able to prove that.
Interesting. So is it possible to have evidence from an all-knowing source besides the Bible?
I'm not sure. You could at least have an expert saying China would agree, and you haven't read it.
Would you agree that we can't predict the future?
No one can know the future for sure, but you can have evidence saying this will happen if you do this, predicting it.
With the Britain example, regardless of whether it was a different agency, different leverage, and mutual consent, would you agree that it was the exact same bonds?
Exact same bonds. It was also, just because it was the exact same bonds doesn't mean it's also the same amount of bonds,
I understand your argument, but you would agree that it was the same bonds?
I don't believe that's relevant, but sure, I'll agree to that.
All right, thanks. Would you agree that our agency has been successful 47 times?
Yeah.
All right. Do you believe that China should pay back their debt to Americans?
No.
Why not?
Because they don't owe it to the United States.
All
The
right,
Republic of China owes it to the United States.
Interesting. Did you read any evidence of that?
My partner read several pieces on that, yeah.
Several pieces? All right, if we could have all those pieces of evidence, that would be great.
Sure.
You also talked about how we have a contradiction because England has a different agency.
Right.
I'd like to ask the question, are credit ratings important?
Maybe, sure. I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter because you haven't shown how the credit rating would actually change.
Interesting. But if we did show that the credit rating would change, would that be a significant deterrence to China?
If you can provide evidence that it would actually deter China.
Interesting. Did you read any evidence that China's credit rating has already dropped because they've apparently already defaulted on this loan?
Yes.
Alright, where was that evidence?
Basically in your 1AC you said that China is not paying back the debt, and then in cross-examination you admitted that your credit rating drops when you don't pay back the debt. Thus, using deductive reasoning or logic, China's technically already defaulted.
Interesting. So we can clarify that in the future, but did you read any evidence that the credit rating already has dropped?
I used deductive reasoning to show that.
Interesting. Alright. Do you believe that the United States should uphold international law or break international law?
That's an obvious question. Obviously, uphold international law.
Alright, and what about China? Should they uphold international law?
I think it's generally desirable for them to uphold international law, yeah.
Alright, thank you. No further questions.
Yep.